All right. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the overlap day of our two networks. My name is Monique Miles, and I am the Deputy Director of the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions, and I am also the Director of the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund at the Aspen Institute. This day is especially exciting for us because it is the day that we bring our two collective networks together, the Collective Impact Forum and the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund. And we, including FSG and the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions team, are excited about the fact that we have 950 people gathered together today on our overlap day. And just to give you a little sense of who's in the audience, we know that of our 950 participants, we have sectors, systems, and different leaders, including training providers, youth, practitioners, community organizers, funders, technical assistance providers, backbone leaders, researchers, and many, many others amongst our network, and we are excited to welcome you all here together today. We have designed a learning agenda for our time that we hope you will find is as rich and complex as the systems, communities, and solutions that you all are a part of. And it is our hope that while these two networks are convened, that you will all have the opportunity to be in dialogue across your areas of focus, and that you can participate in learning exchanges beyond your systems and beyond your sectors. And as we considered the knowledge, the expertise, the passion for change that we know is present, is palpable in this room today, we aimed to create a space of learning that is conducive and responsive to your learning needs. And to this end, we hope that your time together today is of value to you personally and also is of value to the work that you do when you return home to your communities. Now, with that invitation to connect and exchange extended into this room and into our networks, I'd like to pivot and shift to introduce our opening performers. We are happy to host some Boston-based spoken word artists and musicians, and it's important to note that we have highlighted their voices as part of our shared dialogue, part of how we want to be in community together as we are in the practice of listening, learning, understanding, and inspiring each other. So to begin, I want to introduce Dom Jones. He's an artist from Oakland, California. He is currently studying songwriting and music business at Berklee College of Music. She is also a Grammy ambassador for the National Recording Academy of Arts and Sciences and sits on the National Council of Young Leaders. Her accompanist, Oscar Brown III, is also a student at Berklee, currently studying film scoring. And we are so pleased to have them perform at the start of this morning's plenary. They will be performing Dom's original composition, Heaven, about doing good in our daily lives through practice, empathy, and discipline. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you? We're glad to be here today. I do sit on the National Council of Young Leaders and Opportunity Youth United, so it's good to merge my two worlds this morning, music and advocacy. As Monica stated, we're gonna do a song called Heaven. Glad to have Oscar here with me and hope you enjoy it. If heaven were a mile away, we could go every day, but it's never allowed to stay, so we'll crumble into clay. The wind's blowing this way, the storm clouds reminisce with rain. If heaven were a mile away, maybe I'd be on display. They would fly across the sea to define my mystery. They would line up just to see heaven in me. If heaven were a mile away, 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 if heaven were a mile or three, my brother's blood would never bleed. The U.S. wouldn't bomb and leave countries dissolving from greed. And citizens would wake and see the liberties at stake ain't free. If heaven were a mile or three, maybe we'd join hands to be a real nation without walls. Don't feel hatred in our hearts with the language that would cause heaven for all. If heaven were a mile away, 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 keep the bullets in the chamber and pollution out the sea. You can snap if you want to. See the majesty in our differences. Seek my humanity, 'cause the blood we bleed is red. The blood we bleed is red. If heaven were a mile away, 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 away. If heaven were a mile away, if heaven were a mile away, if heaven were a mile away, if heaven were a mile away. Thank you.
Please join me again in thanking Dom and Oscar. Thank you both for so thoughtfully, beautifully, and politically calling us into our time together this morning. I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker. As we consider the national moment that our country is in, and we collectively navigate complex questions such as how to solve multi-generational challenges like poverty, inequality, threats to social, racial, and economic justice, we know that there are many ways to respond to this question. In fact, as I look around this room, I see many people who are working daily and arduously on these core issues. And as we do this work, there are a few things we know are critical to our long-term success, including how we sustain hope and faith for the long-term arc of this work. We also know that it is important to design a theory of action that creates a footpath, a roadmap to the outcomes we seek and the changes that we are aiming for. And finally, we know that in order to figure this all out, we need a way, we need a structure to do so. The life work of our keynote speaker, Marshall Ganz, who has been called the maestro of organizing, is about bringing these pieces together in the fight for justice. As a pioneer of grassroots organizing over the past 5 decades, his work offers a blueprint as we consider the national moment our country is in and collectively answer questions, some of which have come up already in the convening of our Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund network, including who are we as a country and how will our communities respond right now in real time to this moment. Marshall's research, his practice, and his lived experiences reminds us that we have the power in the narrative. It is in the narrative, the stories that we share that drive the movement and get us to the resolutions that we all seek. The life work of Marshall Ganz is a story of working with people, working with communities, and working with movements to answer some of the most important questions that define our times and shape our history. Beginning with his work with the Mississippi Summer Project in 1964 and continuing with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Marshall was called into organizing at an early age. In 1965, he joined Cesar Chavez in his efforts to successfully farm workers in California. Let's give it up for that. And over the next 16 years, he worked with United Farm Workers and gained experience in union, political, and community organizing. For Marshall, this work wasn't about charity or helping. It was about justice and about working with people in a way that is respectful and enhance their agency as well as his own. Marshall went on to become the director of organizing and was elected to the National Executive Board, on which he served for 8 years. During the 1980s, he worked with grassroots organizing and developed new organizing programs and designed innovative voter mobilization strategies for local, state, and national electoral campaigns. He went on to become the architect behind President Obama's first campaign, which organized students and volunteers. He also founded an organization called the Leading Change Network, which brings together a global community of organizers, educators, and researchers, all organizing for democracy. Marshall Ganz is widely published, and in 2009, he won the Michael J. Harrington Book Award for his book titled Why David Sometimes Wins: Leadership, Organization, and Strategy in the California Farm Worker Movement. He's a senior lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where he teaches, researches, and writes on leadership, organization strategy, and social movements, civic associations, and politics. Before officially calling Marshall to the stage, I want to first share that following his address, we are going to hear from Melody Barnes and some local community organizers who will respond to his address and share their own work and solutions for responding to the current moment that our country is in. But before Melody comes up, please first join me in welcoming Marshall to the stage.
Good morning. Come on, you're going to have to do better than that. What is it, 8? It's almost 8:15. It needs to be a very good morning, so let's try again. Good morning. Good morning. All right, that's much better. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to reflect with you today about the role of organizing in addressing critical challenges we face as a community, as a nation, and as a democracy. Modest objectives should take about 5 minutes. But I do want to say that there is something very particular about this audience. Walter Brueggemann, a Protestant theologian, wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination, in which he said that transformational vision occurs at the intersection of what he calls criticality, a clear view of the world's pain and hurt, coupled with hope, a sense of the world's promise and possibility. One without the other leads either to despair or irrelevance, but together they create the energy for transformational change. Young people come of age with a critical eye on the world they find and almost of necessity hopeful hearts. So it was so for my generation, and I hope it is so for your generation. And so I look forward to our dialogue this morning, our conversation this morning about how to make that happen. And this is an extraordinary time. The late Tom Hayden once said, "Change is slow except when it's fast." We're in a fast moment right now, in case you haven't noticed. A moment in which chickens come home to roost, in which we're confronted with truths that we've denied for some time. A moment in which small differences can produce enormous change. And a moment in which the choices we make really matter. It's also a moment in which our democratic institutions may be more at risk than at any time since the 1930s. How do we get there? I'd argue there's 3 principal proximate causes: galloping inequality and fragmentation in terms of class, race, gender, the hollowing out of the capacity of democratic government to do what it needs to do, and the atrophy of non-elite civic political organization, including unions, that rendered many sectors of our country, especially those hardest hit, relatively voiceless. And although we can attribute these realities to globalization, digitalization, and financialization, that's good, I got those right, although certainly they presented major challenges, their consequences, especially in this country, go back to failures in public policy that not only did not respond, but made things worse by privileging reactions of privatizing, marketizing, and donorizing. That's a new word I just invented. That goes back to the 1970s and has turned people into customers or clients rather than citizens engaged with one another in the challenging but critical practice of democratic politics. How we respond to this challenge matters. Addressing the symptoms in domains of health, education, youth, with disciplined, focused, and accountable community collaboration is a very, very good thing. But unless at the same time we're strengthening the voice of the voiceless, rebuilding the capacity for democratic governance, and begin to have a structural impact on the inequality, we have to ask ourselves whether we're trying to compensate for a failing system rather than changing the system. You know the metaphor of the miner's canary. The miners would take a canary down into the mines because if there was poison, the weak respiratory system of the canary would react first and keel over so the miners could get out of the mine. We have to ask ourselves whether we are not only finding ways to save the canary, but doing what we need to do to get the poison out of the mines. In our country, given its problematic electoral structures, a reality of which people have become acutely aware recently, that task has often fallen to social movements, at the heart of which is the practice of organizing. These movements of moral reform modeled as they were on the Great Awakenings of the early 19th century, fought for change on behalf of temperance, abolition, women's suffrage, populist agrarian reform, labor reform, progressivism, civil rights, environmentalism, gender equity. And organizing is indeed focused on problem solving, but on doing so in ways that can develop the leadership to empower the powerless to address the structural problems of political, economic, racial, and gender inequality, thus opening pathways to change. So what I hope we can explore today will be how to solve the urgent problems we try to solve in a way that strengthens the democracy rather than weakening it, and asking whether at the most micro level of analysis and action, are we strengthening the individual and collective agency of those most in need of change or diminishing it? This is why organizers strive to put questions of leadership, constituency, and power at the center of their approach. And this isn't something new. It wasn't even invented in Chicago by Saul Alinsky. But in the West, the organizing tradition has at least three core roots. There's the story of the people who launched a journey from slavery to freedom, as told in the book of Exodus, a faith root, a faith foundation to this work of social change. And then there was the day the Greeks decided they didn't need kings, that they could govern themselves, the beginning of a civic tradition. And then there were popular means like the Irish tenant farmers of a British landlord who withheld their crops until he made the improvements to which he was committed, a man who gave his name to that tactic, Captain Boycott. Yes, that's where the boycott comes from. And I'm grateful for the fact that my introduction to this tradition came in the Mississippi Summer Project in 1964, which is really where my education about race, power, and politics in America began. And the farm workers in California, which helped me learn the difference between charity and justice. Charity asks, what's wrong? How can I help? Justice asks, why is it happening? How can I change it? And that's when people get uncomfortable, because it is often the case that people over here have less because these people have more. And when we try to change that, there's resistance, and there's struggle, and there's conflict. And that's a positive midwife of change. It is how change actually works. So let's talk about organizing. First, let me just find some water. Is there some water? Yeah, to give a good sermon, you need, yeah. First thing about organizing is that it can be understood as a form of leadership that's rooted in three questions posed by a first century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel. When asked about how do I think about what to do in the world, he responded with three questions to ask yourself. The first question, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Now that's not meant to be a selfish question. Here we go. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. That's not meant to be a selfish question, but rather a self-regarding question. If you presume to lead, to take responsibility for others and engage with others, you better be clear about what's in it for you. What are your values? What are your resources? What do you expect from it? But secondly, he says, ask yourself, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what is to recognize that our capacity to realize our objectives is inextricably wrapped up with the capacity of others, that we exist in relationship with others in this world. And thirdly, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Which isn't advice to jump into moving traffic, I don't think. It's a caution against what Jane Addams called the snare of preparation. Just another year of strategic planning, and finally we'll have the perfect plan, and then we'll implement it, and the world will totally conform to our expectations. Is that how it works? The reality is in order to learn to do well what we try to do, we have to often begin to do it. In other words, understanding flows from action. It doesn't precede it. And that takes courage because it means leaping into a dimension of the unknown, which is the future, in order to be able to learn what it takes to create the change that we hope to change. So for me, leadership is about the interaction of these three: self, other, and action. And the fact that they're questions and not answers is also important because it makes clear what the domain of leadership actually is. I don't know if you've had the experience of being in an organization, everything's going great, and people say, where's the leadership so we can thank them? When do people say, who's in charge here? When do they say, where's the leadership? When? Yeah, we know problems, contradictions, difficulties, and it means coming to terms with the fact that the domain of leadership is not one of certainty but uncertainty. It is not about establishing control that we never really can, but how to pursue purpose in the face of uncertainty. And that's challenging and problematic. It's a challenge to the hands. Do I have the skills I need to deal with these new challenges? It's a challenge to the head. Can I use my resources in new ways to deal with these challenges? A strategic challenge. And then, where do I find the hope? Where do I find the courage? How do I inspire that in others? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's really a head, hands, heart proposition when we're thinking about leadership. And the definition that I've come to use is that it's about accepting responsibility because there is a choice for enabling others to achieve shared purpose. So this is not leader as diva or sun, right? And you know, the sun that illuminates, you get close, you get light or maybe burned or whatever happens when you get too close. It's not that idea. It's leadership as a form of social interaction in the pursuit of common purpose under conditions of uncertainty. So that makes leadership less of a practice, less of a position than a practice. Less about trying to assert control than developing the capacity to respond to uncertainty. Now, organizing is, and I do want to say this, it's thinking of leadership as a practice means being clear about the difference between a formal position of leadership, positions of authority, and the exercise of leadership, which aren't they two different things? You know, people in formal positions of authority who are not such great leaders. That ever happen? Doesn't just happen at Harvard. Okay, well, yeah. On the other hand, we meet people in neighborhoods and at kitchen tables and in workplaces who are exercising leadership in the sense that I'm using the term all the time. And so it's understanding it as a practice of which many of us are capable. Now, organizing is a particular form of leadership that asks three more questions. The first question, not what is my issue, but who are my people? Who is the community with whom I am engaging in a leadership contract? With whom am I working? To whom am I accountable? And second, what change do they need rooted in their lived experience and understanding? And what would change look like in terms of their needs? And finally, how can I work with them to enable them to use their resources to build the power that they need to achieve that change? So organizing is not about providing services to grateful clients. It's not about marketing products to customers. It's about turning communities into constituencies. A constituency comes from the Latin constare, which means to stand together. Client, interestingly, comes from the word inclinare, which means to lean upon, to depend upon. Organizing is not about creating dependency. It's about enabling power. And this tradition is an old tradition. So, how does it actually work? Well, one way to think about it is in terms of 5 practices that can enable a constituency to turn its resources into the power it needs to achieve the change it wants. In the Montgomery bus boycott, for example, that launched the modern civil rights movement, people discovered that if they used a resource they all had, Any idea what was the resource they all had in the Montgomery bus boycott that was so critical? Any idea? Yeah, they all had feet. And if they used their feet to walk to work, instead of getting on the bus, on the segregated bus and riding to work, then their individual dependency on the bus company, and the power of the bus company over them as individuals could be turned into their power over the bus company when acting collectively. And that dynamic of how individual resources can be turned into collective power, that's at the heart of what organizing is all about. Because it isn't change coming from out there, it's change coming from right here. And that means changing ourselves even as we change the world around us. Now, one way to think about this organizing framework is at one end, relationships, at the other end, action, and in the middle, story, strategy, and structure as ways to turn the relationships into the power for action. And let me explain what I mean. First, relationships. Organizing is grounded in the building of relationships rooted in shared values based on commitments to work together. Now, it's the process of association with each other, not simply the aggregation of individual resources that can make a whole greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, aggregating a whole lot of mouse clicks at the same time is not the same thing as thousands of people forming relationships with each other so that they can act collectively together. This is an important distinction. It goes to the distinction between mobilizing and organizing. Wael Ghonim, who was one of the leaders of the Tahrir Square movement, in a recent interview, talked about the fact that they mobilized very effectively, turning people out, especially relying on social media to do that. But they didn't organize. They didn't build the horizontal relationships. They didn't build the structures. They didn't develop the leadership. So that when they were successful in getting rid of Mubarak, who was it that was able to pick up the pieces and walk away with them? Not them. It was the people with the organization, which in that case was the Muslim Brothers. So it's very important to understand the difference between individual aggregation and building relationships horizontally and building collective capacity. And although relationships are always based on exchange to some extent, my resources, your interest, my resources, it takes commitment to turn an exchange into a relationship rooted in shared values that give them a future, enabling learning, growth, and development, endowing transactions with the possibility for transformation. Contracts, when you negotiate them, that's done. Relationships, when you form them, they're only beginning because they open out into growth, learning, and new understanding. The core skill in organizing is the one-on-one meeting, the house meeting, and these practices that, in fact, you know, it's interesting, so many of the practices in organizing are things we do all the time anyway. How many people here have ever had a relationship? Let me see. Wait, everybody didn't raise their hand. I don't know. This is kind of, I better rethink that. No, no, but a lot of this is about taking what we know implicitly and making it explicit so that we can bring craft and intentionality and purpose to this work. And that's why we talk about one-on-one meetings, house meetings, and so forth. Now, second, and I'm watching the clock here, I gotta pick up speed. Second, story, narrative. Organizing requires learning to access emotional resources rooted in our values that can enable us to respond to challenges with courage, with hope, empathy, and self-efficacy, as opposed to reacting to them in fear, isolation, and self-doubt. This is the work of public narrative. The role of narrative is based on the fact that we come to know the world in two ways, with the head and with the heart. We map the world of what is cognitively, but we map the value we place on things, people, and experience emotionally. So it is through emotion that our values can inspire action. As St. Augustine observed, it's one thing to know the good, it is quite another to love it. Loving it is what enables action upon it. Knowledge is not sufficient to produce action. It's not that cognition is good and emotion is bad, but rather they are distinct. And there's such a bias, certainly in the academy, against understanding emotion and how it works. That's, emotion, And there's a lot of power and gender, and there's a lot of dynamics involved in that. But it's important to appreciate that emotion has its own language, just as cognition has its own language. Pascal wrote that the heart has reason of which reason does not know. And one of the languages of emotion is narrative, because narrative is one of the ways we've learned to access the emotion to deal with challenges with mindfulness. Most of the time we operate out of habit because it's very efficient. But when confronted by the unexpected, habit no longer works. So we experience these encounters as anxiety. And the anxiety calls our attention to the need for action. So at times, leadership may require that we awaken people to the challenges they face, the work of urgency, the work of anger, not rage, but outrage, so as to create sufficient anxiety that people look at the circumstances with fresh eyes. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy. My job as a leader is to make people anxious. Well, yeah, but the danger is that the anxiety turns into fear, in which case we run away, we strike out, or we freeze and hope whatever it is that's frightening us doesn't get us. Now, that may have been very, very helpful when we had to deal with saber-toothed tigers. But when we began to live with other people, culturally, we developed ways to learn to manage our hearts in order to confront challenges not with fear, but with hope. And that is the work of narrative, how to counter hope against fear, solidarity against isolation, self-worth against self-doubt. Stories are made from a plot, a character, and a moral. And what makes a plot is a protagonist on his or her way to a goal when something happens, the unexpected. The Khaleesi arrives with her dragon. Well, no, that's a Harvard joke. No, it's not really. Something happens, something, and that's when we lean forward and we start paying attention. That's the moment we get interested. Up to that point, it's boring. And we pay attention because of our own encounters with the unexpected, our own, which we seem to be infinitely curious to learn how to handle. Small things like movies sold out of tickets, and then the big things, marriages break up, people get thrown out of school, we lose loved ones for whom we care, about which we can do nothing. It is, in fact, one of the core dimensions of human experience to have to confront the unexpected, to have to deal with those challenges for which, by definition, we are not prepared. And because we can empathetically identify with the protagonist in a story, we are able not only to learn with our heads the moral, like haste makes waste, we actually experience the fear, we experience the hope, and we experience the values, resources the protagonist draws on in order to find the courage to confront those challenges. So the experience of the protagonist becomes our experience. So the moral that a story teaches is less to the head than to the heart. And this is why faith traditions, cultural traditions, families all teach through stories. I mean, that's where you heard your first stories, right? From professional storytellers? Well, sort of. They're called parents, right? You're telling stories. 85% of the time, parents spend with young children in storytelling. It's instruction. It's instruction to the heart. Let me tell you about Uncle Charlie. You don't want to be like Uncle Charlie. You know, he started out right, but he took a wrong turn. So I'll tell you about Aunt Harriet. Come on, every family the world over has those stories. So we are all storytellers. Public narrative is about harnessing the power of story to the work of leadership by accessing it to be able to tell a story of self. That is, to communicate to others through my lived experience why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then a story of us, not a categorical us like everybody with green hair, but an experiential us, the values that we share, the experiences that we share. And a story of now, how to turn this moment into a narrative moment, a moment of challenge, a moment in which we must choose, respond, and a moment of action. And for those of you that watch the Democratic Convention, and saw Michelle Obama's talk? You see that? And contrast with Hillary's? And we showed in my class this year the 6 minutes of each. Michelle speaks through narrative moments, one after another after another. And because of that, we get the emotional meaning of that moment and of the person behind it. Hillary couldn't ever learn to do that. And so she remained opaque behind a screen. And when you're in public life, if you don't author your own story, others will author it for you. So you really have no choice but to claim your own story in public life. Does that make sense? Now, third, and I see I'm going to run just a few minutes over here. Is there a guy with a cane? Or am I okay? Okay. All right, just want to be sure. Okay, third, organizing can't stop at the why. It also has to grapple with the how. How do we turn what we have, our resources, into what we need, power, to get what we want, our goals, our objectives, and change? And that's called strategy. That's called strategizing. Now that means talking about power and taking power seriously. Dr. King described power as the ability to achieve purpose, and it's central to organizing, the capacity to turn resources into new realities. Now, how does power work? Well, everybody gets it, really. If you need my resources, if you need what I got more than I need what you got, who's got the power? You need what I have more than I need what you have, who's got the power? That's right. And reverse it, who's got the power? If I need what you got more than you need what I got, who's got the power? All right, so that's power. Power is influence created by interdependency. And sometimes when we have enough interests in common, we can collaborate in ways that enhance the power of both of us. We call that power with, like a cooperative daycare, like a collaboration, a credit union. But sometimes our interests are in conflict. And when our interests are in conflict, then the question is, how can I make it in your interest to do what I need in order to realize my interests, okay? How can I make it more costly for you to resist change than to accept change? And that's power over. And that's a lot of where the issue in organizing is. Now, the people in Montgomery, Alabama discovered that by using their feet in a different way, they could shift power over them into their power over the bus company, and it achieved change. The American colonists here in Boston, they dumped some tea in the harbor. You know about that? It was a boycott of British goods, of British products, to influence the British government and the merchants. Gandhi used salt. In the farmworkers, we had a grape boycott. The challenge is how to access resources that are more widely distributed, like time, in order to challenge resources that are more tightly held, like wealth. And this challenge of people and wealth is a critical challenge to appreciate and understand how it works and how it can change. The reality is, and the reason I call my book Why David Sometimes Wins, is that while it is probable Goliath will always win, sometimes David does. And it's winning achieved by compensating for resources you don't have with greater resourcefulness, with the creativity to learn the points of leverage and understand how you can enable your people to use their resources in ways to influence the interests of those whose cooperation and collaboration they need in order to get what they want. It often involves conflict, and conflict is often the midwife of change, something not to fear, something to recognize, something to embrace, and something to turn to constructive purpose, which is really what the whole democratic project is about, isn't it? The whole democratic project is about creating a system in which adversarial views can compete with one another and, on the basis of equality, at least theoretically, lead to public choice. That's what politics is supposed to be about. That's what the art of politics is supposed to be about. And that's what we have to reclaim if we're to begin to make changes in the structural conditions that we need to deal with. Now, Fourth, structure. Oh, that ran out already. Social movements are often born in reaction to structures they experience as oppressive. And so in that reaction, they may confuse all structure with being oppressive. But exclusive focus on trying to free oneself from the past can blind us to the need to organize ourselves to become free to create a better future. Freedom from to freedom to. And the reality is that traditional ways of structuring authority, often one person, often a male, giving everyone else orders, have not really worked in many settings for a long, long time. On the other hand, rejection of the need for structure can easily result in what feminist scholar Joe Freeman called the tyranny of structurelessness. You know, you go to that meeting and, well, we don't believe in structure here. We don't have any leaders here. What Freeman points out is that anytime human beings get together, they will structure themselves. And it's either going to be on the books, visible, transparent, and accountable, or it's going to be off the books. Personalities, factions, and well, who's in charge here? Does that sound familiar at all? The point is to find the sweet spot between those two, which is what we've been working on the last several years, which is about the development of collaborative leadership teams that can cascade leadership outward in a distributed way. It's not a new thing. Moses' father-in-law Jethro in Exodus 18 tells him he's going to burn himself out if he keeps trying to do it all himself. And he's got to find the folks to delegate with and to engage as well. So team-based leadership is critical, I think, to structure. Finally, action. Changing the world requires mobilizing and deploying resources in new ways that enable us to learn from our failures as well as our successes. One measure of the impact of an organizing campaign can be evaluated by counting votes, people, events, policies, laws. Achieving real outcomes, in turn, requires the commitment of real resources, time, money, effort to the task in ways that can be counted. I was taught in organizing, if you can't count it, it didn't happen. But one challenge is to determine the right metrics, what it is to assess progress or lack of progress toward our goals, not only for purposes of accountability and recognition, but most of all for learning. If we don't know what we're doing, how can we learn to do it better? Learning to make change, in turn, is not a matter of following a blueprint, but rather discovering pathways to learning as we go. The process of changing the future is not anything anyone has a blueprint to. It's a pathway we have to discover, and we have to be smart about discovering that pathway by honestly assessing our failures, learning from them, and our successes as well. And because in organizing, commitment is the foundation of power, because you're asking people to commit their time, it is a fundamental skill, learning how to ask people for commitment. And let me just ask you right now, how many people in this room found it easy to ask other people to commit? Yeah, that's the truth. The reality is we got to learn to do that, because unless we are able to make claims on others, see, it's not like we're asking people to do us a favor. We're creating an opportunity for people to make a difference. But you can't make a difference without sacrifice. You can't make a difference without commitment. So sometimes we try to focus on making things so easy that we think that's what motivates people, when in reality what motivates people is making it valuable, is making that it will make a difference, that it will matter. And that's really where the work lies. We bring this work together in one way, by developing leadership as fundamental to learning these practices, diffusing these practices, and building and deepening their capacity within our communities and constituencies. We also bring it together temporally in terms of time. Stephen Jay Gould wrote, there's two ways to think of time. Time is an arrow, time is a cycle. Time of a cycle is a rhythm of continuity. Time of arrow, as an arrow, is a rhythm of change. We recognize that in the way we organize a campaign as opposed to a program. A campaign in which we start without the resources we need so that we can build the resources we need in the course of getting there. It's not, let me wait till I get my grant, then I'll start. You're going to be waiting for a long time. I got to start. I got to build. Then I develop the resources that I need in the course of building, and that's what campaigns do. Finally, conclusion, end. The success of an organizing campaign is thus evaluated not only in terms of whether it solved the immediate problem, but whether it did so in such a way as to empower a constituency with new economic, political, and cultural capacity, and at the same time developing the leadership that will enable it to grow, get to scale, and create the power to achieve the structural change that we need. One of the main reasons why organizing in the civil rights movement hooked me was that it was about working with people to find the resources within themselves and each other to create the power to change the institutions around them responsible for their problems in the first place, and that's what democratic governance should enable us to do. So I'm just going to conclude here with a song. I'm not going to sing. In the 4th grade, they told me, would you please just mouth the words, and that was sort of I was a very mean teacher. That was sort of the end of the singing career. But this was a song recorded from the 1960s, recorded by Judy Collins, and it uses the word freedom. And I want to explain, the civil rights movement never called itself the civil rights movement. It called itself the freedom movement. Freedom is a much bigger word than legal rights. Freedom is about dignity, it's about community, it's about power, it's about the capacity to act and shape one's own future. So think of it in that sense. And the song goes like this: freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing, doesn't fall down like the summer rain. Freedom is a hard-won thing. You have to work for it, fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children, brother. Pass it on to your children, sister. They have to work for it. They have to fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation has to win it again. Pass it on to your children. Pass it on. Thank you for the opportunity to pass some of it on. Thank you.
Well, Marshall, if you had wanted to have sung that last song, we were willing to accompany you in some way. But, so thank you so much. I believe that you just gave us a masterclass in community organizing, so that is deeply, deeply appreciated. And now what we want to do is to connect the community organizing lessons that you just provided us to the work that so many of us in this room are doing with Collective Impact. And what can we learn, and how can we continue to refine the work that we're all doing? My name is Melody Barnes, and I'm the chair of the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions. And in a second, I'm going to introduce the other members of the panel who you've already not met this morning. But I just want to start out by talking just for 2 minutes or less about Collective Impact. You know, there are certain words or phrases that you only have to say one word, and it immediately tells you something about a person or a place or a thing. When we talk about Standing Rock, immediately it takes us to a place. You know, Marshall was just talking about the civil rights movement. When you say Birmingham or Selma, it immediately takes you to a place. You know what we're talking about. On the lighter side of things, when you say Beyonce, you immediately know who we're talking about. Collective Impact, in many ways, since that article written in 2011, has taken on that kind of meaning. And for better or for worse, people respond to the phrase collective impact. It certainly sparked a conversation about a set of elements that we all know to be important, to inherent to collective impact. And it sparked that new conversation while at the same time, we know that it sits beside and it stands on the shoulders of community organizing and other kinds of collaborative practices. What we've also learned since 2011, that many people were already doing this work. Collective Impact, in the article that John and Mark wrote, really just provided a title to it and put that into a larger frame and disseminated that not only nationally, but also internationally. But at the same time, we also know, because of what's happening, because of what so many of you all were already doing in your communities, that collective impact had to continue to change and to evolve and to grow. That we started talking more, and very importantly, about issues like equity. and community engagement, and how that had to be a part of this larger frame of collective impact. And I think that if we're smart, we will continue to grow and to continue to bring all that we learn in our communities to this frame so that we can continue to refine it. But there's much to be learned, and I think that, as I said, because we stand on the shoulders, because we sit beside other kinds of collaborative work, we have to learn from the kind of conversation that Marshall just began describing for us. And so that's what we want to do in this morning's panel, to have that conversation so that we can go out into our communities, go back home, and bring that work to our initiatives there, but also come back together collectively and continue to see how we evolve and we grow. So in doing that, I've got a really wonderful group of people here with me. You've already been introduced to Marshall in such a wonderful way. Next to me, I'm not going to go into any great detail. You've got the information in your packets. But sitting next to me, I have Shakima Fulmore-Townsend, who is the CEO of the Philadelphia Youth Network, who has been doing that work in such a wonderful, deep way for many, many years. Sitting next to Shakima, we have Marjorie Parker, who's the Deputy Executive Director of Jobs First New York City. And then sitting, I'm sorry? Oh, okay. I was like, can I not read? Okay. I put myself in my own pathway. Yes, congratulations on that. Sorry. And then sitting to her right, we have Mark Philippart from Policy Link. So I want you to join me in welcoming them to the stage. So thank you. So I want to start out just very generally and ask you all for your response and reaction to Marshall's comments. I mean, because of the work that you do, and Mark, I'll start with you, because Policy Link spends a lot of time working in communities all over the country. So you see the kind of collaborative work that's happening there. You all try to work with those communities. I know that equity and community engagement have been such a deep part of the work that you've done, so I'm curious about your reaction to what Marshall just shared with us.
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. Thank you, Marshall, for your talk. I think from my perspective, it was incredibly helpful to hear all of that laid out in a really powerful way. PolicyLink has been working for nearly 20 years to advance equity, and our work has, as Melody indicated, involved a really deep relationship with community and putting community at the forefront of the change that we hope to see. My work specifically at PolicyLink is focused on improving outcomes for boys and men of color. And in that capacity, I do a number of different things, many of which you'll see in your program packet. But the thing that I think most resonates with Marshall's talk is really our leadership to support the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, which is a network of grassroots leaders in California primarily that are focused on improving outcomes for that population. And through that work, I see all of these strategies that you've outlined come into play. We're working with organizers, supporting them in a deep way to be able to realize the vision of their constituents. So, that involves at least on our part, operating with a collective impact framework, yes, but that's really running in the background. That undergirds all of the work that we do, and it's a framework that they are probably not so familiar with because we don't necessarily trot it out in a very public way, but it's everything that they're doing. And so I think it definitely, your talk definitely resonates with me in that regard. Because our communities who we're working with are really focused on building power in a way that addresses the issues that are most important to their constituents.
So Marjorie, I'm curious in particular because of the deep work that you've been doing in New York City, what your response is.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Well, my first reaction was that Khaleesi did arrive with a dragon in the form of Marshall Gans. what struck me was the portion around how movements are started by emotional connection, and that Job Search NYC was born out of an emotional connection. We had a crisis in New York City 10 years ago with over 232,000 young adults who were out of work and out of school. When the data got out and the communities saw that my community is on that list, people wanted to do something about that. And our local philanthropists had, what we had was borough-based, borough-wide community convening with stakeholders across the 5 boroughs of New York City, trying to make a decision about what should be done. And those rooms were as full as these rooms. People wanted to get stuff done. What we've been doing is really enabling those communities over the last 10 years, keeping the emotion present, helping to enable them to organize, tapping into where they think that they're empowered to begin to make the changes, and working with them throughout the process to getting broader community and broader stakeholder commitment, keeping the passion alive. And so I'm very inspired by just this, going back to talk about community organizing. The Collective Impact is built on that. I shared with Melody that when the Collective Impact frame became public in 2011, I was quite happy because it was almost, I went back to grad school after I'd started working and started managing, and suddenly everything that I couldn't really name in the most professional way had a name. And so for me, Collective Impact framed many things that a lot of us have been doing and haven't named in a consistent way that a community can begin to identify within a frame and name those frames and what they're doing on those frames. So thank you for this morning.
Shakima.
So first, I have to say, hello, everybody. It's so nice to be with 950 of my closest friends. So welcome. It's nice to see you all. Marshall asked the question, who are my people? And the intersection of faith and the way in which you seamlessly sort of stood firm on your values through the way that you introduced us to the organizing work, I said, there's my people. So this is really refreshing to see that and to be in this space. I think there were a couple of things that struck me, but it's mostly this issue of conflict. Conflict is the midwife of change. And I thought, yes, I'm the person in the room. There's an elephant. I want to introduce myself to the elephant. I want to know, why are you here? What's going on? And sometimes we tend to, avoid conflict. But at the Philadelphia Youth Network, we've been fortunate to be the backbone for Project U-Turn and really looking at the challenge of high school graduation in Philadelphia. And the conflict that was underlying that was really who's at fault for the future of our young people. And we made some really concrete decisions very early on about the power, the intersection of power and influence, the intersection of policy and practice, the intersection of practice and systems change. We work in an intersection, or like what I say to my staff, we work in the tensions. If it feels too good, it is wrong. We need to do something different because we are in the space of alleviating tensions. And the tension that we had to address in our community was we were all responsible. And when we started this work, we were at a 52% graduation rate. And we weren't sure exactly why that was happening. And just as many kids were leaving school and continued to leave school. And we had to make a choice that this was not about blame, but it was about declaring the reality that we hope to see for young people. It was about looking into this space and seeing who they could be and recognizing our responsibility and creating an environment for that. And so when you think about power and the change of power, well, yes, some other people had other things that we needed more than they did, but we held the future of young people as the greatest source of power. And that's promoted change over the last 10 years. And we've seen our graduation rate increase significantly to 66%. And we're going to use that same strategy to push further into the conflict, push further as midwives of change and make that happen.
Well, and Marshall, as you have heard more about Collective Impact, as you've heard the members of this panel describe some of their work, I'm curious, when you think about the depth of experiences you've had thinking about community organizing, where do you see the challenges for us with collective impact, the places where we need to learn more from community organizing? What can we bring into the work that we do?
I don't want to claim to expertise that I don't have. So I'm a bit reticent because I haven't been within the collective impact world. But my sense is that there are problems that can be addressed by bringing community leaders together, discovering where their common interests lie, and mobilizing resources on behalf of those problems and address them. But there are other problems in which there is a deep conflict of interest, like, for example, wage rates. Deep conflict of interest. Now, when you have those conflicts of interest, then you have to address the question of power. And that often entails conflict and struggle. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But it's not the line of first action, but it's got to be there. And it also, how can I put this? There are problems that can be solved locally, but there are many problems that can't. They have to be acted on locally, but they have to be acted on, but those actions have to add up to more. And that's where the art of politics comes in. The whole question of national purpose and local action, the combination. I think sometimes we get stuck in thinking, oh, it's all going to be done from DC, and so we just mobilize some people. Well, that doesn't work. Then over here, we're just going to work at the local level. Well, we can get so far, but only so far, because a lot of these economic forces and political forces are powerfully translocal. Now, unless we use our politics to do that, and I don't mean just electoral politics, but I mean even restoring the role of government. I mean, for the last 30 years, government's been eviscerated. State, local, national level, tax base gone. How do we solve these public problems without public resources in reality? So I think that we have to be conscious of the need to solve problems in such a way that they create the basis for actually going deeper and broader into these kinds of structural challenges, which unless we address them, we're just going to continue going backwards. And yeah.
No, I was just going to say, it feels like you're talking about a both-and proposition in terms of both the approach that we take, but also both-and national, state, and local.
Yeah, and I think sometimes distraction with the national stuff. See, it's kind of like sometimes heads with no bodies or bodies with no heads. I mean, it's like it's all up here, we get focused on that, and we forget, unless it's locally grounded, we don't really have the power. I mean, that to me is one of the problems, certainly of progressive politics for the last at least 20 years, has been substituting, mobilizing people who already agree with us, as opposed to engaging with people who don't. That takes organizing. When you organize a union, you can't just go in and mobilize the people that are already for you. You've got to engage everybody, not to compromise with them, but to convert them. But you don't do that through messaging. You do that through relationship, through engagement, through organizing. And that's the stuff, that's where I think we need to go with this.
And I want to come back to that point in a second, because I think that's so important, particularly at this moment in time. But Mark, I also though want to ask you and Marjorie and Shakima as well, as you have been doing the work that you do, and you all have a national vision, but you also do deep work in community, and the work that you all do in community, where are the points of refinement that you all would identify? I mean, collective impact has continued to grow, we've iterated, but what would you put out there as this is a place where we really need to do some additional work to strengthen our movement?
Yeah. And I'll start. Just reflecting on our experience nationally and in California, I think if you're going to pursue racial equity, if you're focused on outcomes that are going to move the needle in that arena, you have to confront power. And in many instances, the implementation of collective impact often ignores that and actually places the decision-making, power, authority, leadership within the hands of those who are vested in maintaining the status quo. And so what we have done within our work in California in particular, with the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, is really put the power into the hands of grassroots leaders and community organizers who are actively working at this tension that Shakima pointed out, who are actively working at the intersections, who are actively working to resist, to build power in their communities and neighborhoods. And then we help them bridge their work to be able to magnify their impact at the state level. In California, we have, somewhere around 1,000 school districts. We have 58 counties. We have over 500 cities. And the scale of all of that really means that, working on a problem in Oakland or working on a problem in Fresno won't get you to the aggregate level that you need to be at in order to affect real change. And as Marshall stated, you can only get so far in those neighborhoods and communities. And so we've often had to rely on a state policy strategy because our state is also one that is locally driven. And so given our limited resources, we've had to really aggregate up whatever resources we have and whatever power we're able to build in communities to be able to affect state level change. And over the past 6 years, we've contributed to or supported nearly 80 legislative items that really improve outcomes for boys and men of color, their families and communities from cradle to career. So we're very proud of that, but I think it only comes because of a critical race analysis, a critical understanding of structural barriers. You mentioned the Miners Canary. A lot of the work in the boys and men of color arena has really been grounded in Lonnie Guinier's seminal work, which is also the Miners Canary. That's right. And so people have an understanding that, boys and men of color, very vulnerable population, are often the first symptom of, fragmented, disempowered communities. So using that analysis, using their lived experience as really the spear to which they can begin to act and to push for what they want, I think has been really successful for us.
That's great. That's really great. Yeah, that book by Lonnie, and everybody should read that.
Yes.
Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres, The Miners Canary. That's exactly the source.
Right, and probably one of the many reasons that Lonnie was so vilified.
Oh, boy, no kidding.
Which is an understatement. And I'm going to go to Q&A in about 4.5 minutes exactly. But I want to go back to this point you were making about personal narrative and during your comments, your remarks, but also the point you were making a second ago. And I know when we were speaking earlier, and Shakima, you were talking about the importance of personal narrative at the tables at which you've been sitting. But here's my question and why I think it's so important at this moment. There are multiple narratives that people are articulating right now. And there's a narrative that I believe many of us in this room would articulate about a progressive narrative, an effort to claim and reclaim power and to move forward with a progressive agenda. And there is one that is 180 degrees diametrically opposed to that. And those narratives are not even related to one another. And they are certainly, people who are articulating the other one don't hear this one. There is a completely different world in which they are living, in which they are receiving information. And I'm just curious, as that's happening, because of the great emotion that you described that's necessary for change, with which both of those narratives are being articulated, how do we address that problem as we are trying to articulate and drive our narrative, as we are trying to use that emotion to build change, to claim power, to move forward with a progressive agenda, and we're running into the brick wall of people who aren't even hearing our narrative and articulating their own with the same level, or certainly a level of heat and anxiety that they perceive as being very real in their version of the world that we live in right now.
So you just saved up the easy questions. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got, I said, we'll go to
boy.
Q&A in 4.5
No,
minutes.
I think it's important to recognize what you just described as a reality. And there is a struggle there, there's a fight there. But there are different ways to fight the fight. I mean, not by compromising what your values are, but by actually engaging with others in trying to find enough commonality of value that it can open up learning. I mean, that's what we do when we're organizing, and like People Against the Union, For the Union. Very tough thing. What you find, and it's interesting, this recent research on deep canvassing that's been done in the context of marriage equity, marriage equality. Do you know the stuff I'm referring to? It's very interesting work done by the gay community in targeting communities that disagreed with them, and found that through interpersonal conversation, narrative-based conversation, it's not like all of a sudden the world changes, but there's a discovery of enough common ground there just in terms of fundamental lived experience of caring for children, of caring for the future of one's children, of one's own security, the sense of dignity that we all deserve and need. But not theoretical discussion, a sharing of lived experience. You begin to create an opening, a possibility then for a deepening of understanding. And that kind of deep engagement, I don't think we've done that for years. Because our bias is to do messaging, marketing, the latest DC consultocracy product, and it's like, that's not where it's at. It's about this going into talking to people, engaging with people. And I don't mean to make that sound simple. It's not. It's really tough. It's evangelical work, really. And actually, I think that the other side has done much more evangelical work in that sense than we've been doing. And I think we need to do that because our values really matter. They really matter.
I think probably tying the question you had previously in this one, what our experiences taught us over the last 10 years, we're just entered our 10th year, our mission, right, founded in this idea of leveraging resources across institutions and the private and the public sector and community to get to greater outcomes. What we've learned over the last 10 years is that we often think, and I think I told Melody that I occasionally have this random thought that we've overreached as a sector. A community is not ready until it's ready. We think that just because the conditions are on the ground and the symptoms are evident, that community is ready for us to intervene. And this is why the work, you say change is slow, but then it happens quickly, and we're in a fast moment now. Because that's what happens when you're on the ground organizing, when you're engaging stakeholders, when you're helping them to understand that you can do something. But if you've been in a community that has been under-resourced, underserved, oppressed, as many experience it, you think people would want to jump on and say, there's a solution here. They have to find it. And what we've learned is that communities aren't ready. We've had some challenges in some communities that we've entered because we've been invited in. But when we got there, the folks that invite you in aren't the ones that the community responds to. They largely see them as folks who use the community for their own purposes. So you have to ensure people, so if you want to change minds, you want to get people on the same page, but they're not ready until they're ready. And this is where change takes a long time. And so in this political environment, simply, you see the differences when you watch TV, for example. I have that in my own family. You should hear the shouting that happens when we get together for Thanksgiving. And so you have to understand that you only get there when you get there, when you understand that you need to make that change and that you have those things in common, you're not so different. And that's what in this collective impact and community organizing framework that we always have to be aware of, that the conditions that dictate the symptoms doesn't mean that the community is ready for our intervention, right? So let's do that.
And I think that you said a good point about being invited. There's
Yes.
no substitute for authentic engagement. And so at the end of the day, we all find it easy to sit around the room with our friends and, conspire and congratulate each other. But at PYN and through Project U-Turn, I have learned that some of my best strategies come from what I call the BFF method. So it's the person that's rubbing up against me the hardest. It's the person who is really challenging my patience and sometimes my Christianity and all of those things as a leader. And I have had to develop the discipline to, one, do some self-reflection, like why is this bringing up this emotion in me? Who am I seeing before me? What lived experience am I reliving through your oppression or communication style or all of those things, right? And so it starts with me being really clear about what's driving me, and then making a choice, choosing to be responsible as a leader, and choosing to BFF that person, to find this space of connection, to find this space of friendship, to understand more, to be courageous enough, bold enough, crazy enough some days, to ask questions about the thing that is challenging me the most, and the vulnerability that comes with that, seeking counsel, being honest with my team and saying, I'm actually not ready to engage with that person because Shakima, or as I joke, I say Brooklyn Shakima, she's at the elevator, and sometimes President and CEO Shakima and Brooklyn Shakima don't agree on what to do next. And I need, and that's just real human leadership, right? And I need that reflection, self-reflection, but also the honesty and the space of authenticity for folks to pour into me and say, actually, if Brooklyn Shakima goes, you sacrifice everything that we just got. And is it worth those things? And to challenge myself to find the space of connection, to understand what's motivating them, and to see the opportunity. The obstacle is always clear. The opportunity is often hidden behind emotion, behind motivation, behind your experiences. And it is the responsibility, I think, in the work of collective impact and common language and shared metrics and shared goals for us to really be honest about that and to really do that work and to simplify the language so that we can get to the core of the issue. And I think this political climate is gonna require a little bit of BFFing. If to understand a little bit better. Some of my best strategy has come from really understanding, oh, that's what's motivating you. How can I maximize that to achieve this other goal? And so that takes art. That's the skill, that's part skill and part art. Right, and a whole lot of discipline to do that.
Senator Kennedy used to say, some of it's chemical. Just waiting for that moment. Well, you all see we have this amazing panel. I want to invite you all to ask your questions of them now as well. I think are there people with microphones? Okay, so if you raise your hand and let us know where you're from. A hand has gone up right here, right in front. This woman, where are we going? Do we have a microphone? The woman in the black dress.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm from Kansas City, and thank you all so much for your contributions to the field of organizing. I'm so honored to hear you speak. My question kind of speaks to Melody's last comments and also to something that Marshall said about structures. I was taught early on that structures channel power, and so I'm thinking now about institutional structures that engage organizers. So whether we're talking about like neighborhood organizations or big national networks like AFSCME or PICO, and I'm curious about how do we ensure that the interests of these institutions, like keeping their doors open or paying their people or getting that next big grant, how do we ensure that those interests don't supersede the interests of the base and that they don't become more important to the function of organizing, to the practice of organizing, than the interests of the base?
Okay. Does anyone have thoughts on that? It sounds like you were kind of some of the very practical day-to-day, but doesn't supersede the mission and the purpose for the organization in the first place. So
one of the key questions I think you have to ask is, where does the organization get its power? And if it gets its power from writing proposals, that's where its accountability is going to be. And if it gets its power from its constituency, that's where the accountability will be. In other words, if the organization is actually deriving its power from the participation and engagement of its constituency, not just few people who are committing the time, taking the risks, and doing the rest of it, then there's a natural kind of accountability that's built into it. But if, on the other hand, it's all about getting the latest grant, and then we fund ourselves, and then we sort of, we work with the community, but we're not really depending on the community, well then, where's the accountability? So, I mean, I think there are structural norms you can establish for how you make decisions, for democratic decision making and so forth that are important. But I think the reality of what you depend on for your power, I think is crucial. And if you structure out dependency on your constituency, whether it's for their time or their money or their risk taking or their engagement, then you're on the way to what you're describing, I think. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I can just add to that. In the, so JobSource NYC, we're intermediary. So we're neutral intermediary. I think intermediaries have become probably the next hot topic in our sector, and everyone is building one and creating one. In the collective impact frame, in the fifth recommendation, there is forming a backbone organization. Sometimes there's a confusion between forming a backbone and intermediary. We were born as an intermediary. The great thing about being an intermediary is that you have to be comfortable with uncertainties. You have to be comfortable with the idea that you don't know if you influence a behavior change, because there's so many factors happening in a community on a daily basis that may cause a change to happen. The thing that you do know is that you went in to help organize, right? And you can't claim credit for much. You try to aggregate information, you try to baseline a community, and you try to say, this is where it was when we got there, and this is where it is now 10 years later. But you can't simply just claim credit for anything. And so structures in the collective impact frame, or organizing and providing technical assistance, but not claiming authority, right? And if you keep that in mind, I don't know if you're an intermediary, or a backbone, if you do those things, then the structure never supersedes and become the authority for the community. The community, your role is to help the community becomes the authority for the community. And so it is very difficult to do. If you run a direct service nonprofit, it's always about the outcomes, right? It's always about writing the proposals. It's always about claiming credit, because you need to claim the credit to get that next amount of fund. When you're an intermediary, it's never about that. But you have to find a way to baseline and aggregate and share your impact, shared impact. Get your community to that storytelling you talk about. If the community is not telling the same story that you're telling, then you have done something wrong. And so it's a mindset switch, and I had to become comfortable with not knowing.
I think it's also about the value as well. So what you described is, how do you almost have checks and balances between the real need to manage and do the work, which I appreciated Collective Impact for naming, and the realities of the impact and the authority that the people have. And for me, it's in addition to Marshall's question about where does the organization derive its power, it's what value are you bringing? And if there is a conflict between what the people want and the value that you're bringing, that's a space of reflection. And I think we are an intermediary as well, but I often tell people we're not your mama's intermediary, right? Like, we are not your average intermediary. We do actually do direct service for this space of learning, incubation, and scaling. We also fund other folks, but we fund people, and yet we have like little to no authority and power. Really, it rests in change happens in community. That's a value that we believe in. We also believe in learning by doing. So we really rely on a network of over 60 organizations to do what they do best, so that we can learn and scale and grow. And if there's not bi-directional learning and value that's happening in that relationship, we're in a space of a problem. And we've chosen to, define ourselves as a transparent intermediary, because there's nothing neutral about what we believe young people deserve in Philadelphia. And that was a huge shift for our organization and a huge shift for the work, and it's paid off in spades because our relationships have strengthened. Because all of a sudden, with the transparency, people begin to see the spaces that we have in common, as opposed to painting us as the people who don't have skin in the game. We got a lot of skin, I got arms, I got legs. We have a lot of things in the game, but we also have structures in place to respect the will of the group. And that is, I think, been the best tension to hold. And we don't get any credit. And we're okay with that as long as the impact happens. And I say oftentimes, if you need somebody to clap for you, this is not the place to work because nobody's clapping. They don't call me and say, where's the leader? Can I thank her? That doesn't happen often. It does happen sometimes. Thank you, team. But we don't claim credit, and we also just focus on the result. We don't want to be right. We want results. And that's a tough pill to swallow, to ask yourself every day, do I want to be right or do I want to get results? And oftentimes it has to be about the result, which means you'll sacrifice.
Okay, I see a man, the white jacket or shirt on.
Hi, my name is Roop. I've come from India, and it's been an absolute privilege to listen to you all. So I heard you say people are not ready until they're ready. And in my understanding, when you're working on collective impact projects, the task begins with getting the people on the table, the right people on the table, and build linkages that are emotional, that are strategic. And in that process, you also speak that there will be people who will have status quo agenda, and some of them will obstruct because they may not be ready for the change, they may not be holding the anger, whatever be the reason. Is there a balance that you often find yourself playing between honesty and transparency and manipulation in this game, in this process?
Manipulation and what? Can you repeat?
You said manipulation?
For instance, we've been hearing from yesterday that people who've implemented collective impact projects, in very practical terms, will find, they've brought people onto the table. Some of them may not be interested. They may say that, hey, I'm not ready for this. As a facilitator, you may think that, they're very important stakeholders. They have the power to decide and all of that. But they may say that I'm not interested in making the change happen. I think things are fine the way they are with incremental changes. Now, in the process, when you're building lateral linkages, therefore, you're creating some kind of power cohorts. So some people will fall off the game. You may be very well seen as to be the manipulator that's making that happen, right? So is there some sort of tension between being perceived as a manipulator in that process and being absolutely honest and transparent in that process?
I'll take the first part, I think, of the question, and I hope I'm responding to what you're asking. So Jobsters NYC has worked with several communities across New York City to build collaborations and partnerships. Our work is based on the idea that no single institution alone can get anything done, and that multiple institutions across multiple sectors can get more done and get to greater outcomes for the communities that they're in. Oftentimes, when we are invited into a community, we have to deal with a range of actors. And so one recent example is in the last 2 years, and this change is slow thing, we spent about 24 months on Staten Island in New York City. We were invited in by Betsy Dubofsky, I think is here somewhere, Betsy, who saw a publication that Josper shared, identifying one of her communities that she works with on Staten Island as being on the list of the top 18 communities across New York City with the highest numbers of young people who are out of work and out of school. In our first open community call, we had 63 or 73 organizations in the room. What we learned over the last 2 years is that, and we know this too, large anchor institutions that get the significant or are the largest portion of money that comes into a community are often interested in making sure that stays that way. And so when they show up at the table, it's often about, and some small ones too, about how will this impact the monies that I raise for my mission. And it is valuable. And in the process, you do find that there are people who will try to sabotage the process, who will be naysayers. And it ranges from just being at the table saying it to calling their city council member to come up and talk to us about why us as interlopers and outsiders are in the community, which then we say, well, we're invited in by Betsy Dubosky, who says, we are the singular institution on Staten Island that funds almost every nonprofit here. We'd like to have an open discussion about what we can do as a community. It took us 2 years to get past some of the skepticism, obstruction, talking to several politicians, but we always had to remain neutral, right? So in the process of doing this is that we cannot take a position beyond the position of the community. So if the majority of the community is saying, we want this change, that's our position. If the community says, we're not ready for you, then that becomes where we're not ready for them, and we step back. So you have to deal with that when you work with communities. You mentioned that you don't have, you can have constituent population, but when you do community level work, it's the community. And so you have to deal with those resistance, you have to deal with the obstructors, you have to deal with the people they call on you. This is why intermediaries are important, right? Because our stake in the game is the community winning. And so we deal with the push and pulls and confrontations.
I think the community is also not homogenous, right?
Yes.
And so at the end of the day, all the work doesn't happen in the space of that public meeting.
Yes.
And we often talk about and then we say behind the scenes disruptive. So there are things that are gonna work very well in public settings, and there are other things that are gonna work over coffee, over tea, over lunch, over drinks, whatever it is in exercise, whatever the space of connection happens. But I guess I would say that all the work is not gonna happen in the public meeting, and this is about working on multiple levels to understand the balance, and there's value in both sides. And I think that if there's resistance, that's a form of data. That's information that you really do need to become curious about, not threatened by, right? And so that's something that it's a different way. It's a mindset shift.
Yes.
It's a mindset shift.
If I could just, in Matthew 10:16, Jesus says to his followers, if I am to set you as sheep among wolves, you must be innocent as doves and wise as serpents. That combination is what it takes to make change. Intentionality and manipulation are not the same thing.
Yes.
Manipulation is opaque and it operates contrary to the interests of those with whom you're engaging. Intentionality is transparent and in the interests of those with whom you're engaging, and intentionality is crucial. And that's an alternative way to look at it.
If I can give one example, what we found in our work in California in particular is that we were working to address harsh school discipline policy. We knew that many of our constituencies were significantly impacted by the discipline practices that were occurring in schools. And so when we began to have conversations with different community leaders about the issue, we quickly saw that there was conflict and there was tension. While everyone agreed that suspension and expulsion were rampant, and the cause for the suspensions and expulsions was because of very subjective practices like suspending or expelling for willful defiance, there was also tension within the community in the sense that some people felt like their population of students were being threatened and the other students who were doing the threatening or the bullying, if you will, needed to be put out of class for their student safety. And I'm specifically talking about LGBTQ, queer and trans youth, and on the other side, those who were suspected of bullying were most oftentimes kids from the hood, as we would like to characterize them. Young people who, by virtue of where they are growing up, have to have a more aggressive stance in every facet of life just for a matter of survival. And so we had to really work to resolve these tensions, but we did it through relationship-centered organizing. We did it through focusing people on results, because both communities were concerned about the suspension and expulsion rates. The queer and trans young people were concerned because when you look at the data, they were also being suspended and expelled, primarily though for different reasons, not conforming to the status quo. And the young people who were more aggressive or who were getting into altercations, who were being suspended for behavioral issues, were also finding challenges with suspension and expulsion. So we tried to find common ground. But we couldn't do that without the relationship. So at the end of the day, the relationship and the result were what anchored us in being able to get through that.
Okay, I see this hand right here, the woman right here, and as your microphone's coming to you, I want to make sure I'm not leaving out anyone in the back. You have a question? Okay, so we'll go to him next. Please, go ahead. Yes.
Okay, I have a question related to the conversation that you're just having right now in terms of how to translate the language around results-based accountability for use in our communities, because we're finding it pretty complex to be able to take that language in that frame and to get authentic information, support, work done in a way that you're talking about for the communities. And I'm actually hosting a dine around tonight if people are interested in continuing this conversation, because we are struggling with that. So I don't have the answers, so don't come thinking I have the answers, but if you have some, please come.
Well, thank you for
300 people will show up in your
I was about to say, thanks for the invite. I have to fly out, so I won't be joining you for dinner tonight, but I am a fan of results-based accountability, and we actually, as an organization, use that framework to measure results across our initiatives. And I think there are a couple of tricks that you could use that are really exciting. So one of the first things that we did was take the language to young people and ask them to translate it. So this means this. How would you measure impact? It was very, very fascinating to do this work because we were looking for ways to demonstrate that summer employment. So we are the backbone, although we don't necessarily define ourselves like that locally, for 2 collective impact initiatives, one being Project U-Turn and the other being Work Ready Philadelphia. And we were looking for ways to demonstrate that summer employment was impactful to young people, and we needed to measure it on their terms. So what was a change in condition for you? And it was really things like simple, like I'm able to get my nails done and I wasn't able to do that. So we began to ask questions about, when we started to measure change, what are the things you can do now that you could not do before? We translated skills. What does this mean when our programs are designed to work on teamwork and collaboration? What does that mean for you? I'm able to work with my colleague or another young person and I don't get frustrated when they say things that bother me, right? And so utilizing, taking the language and simplifying the language, and I think that is one of the things I would say as a growth area for collective impact. I think it gave us great language. It's highly intellectual on most days, and we have to simplify the language. And we as an organization just went through a process to simplify both our vision. So our vision is to address poverty and inequity through education and employment. It used to be much more complex with a lot more words, and there was a prize for anybody who could say them all in the right sequence. That was not who we wanted to be. And so I think if you could engage the people that you are invested in supporting and in developing those common agenda, ask that question. Be curious enough to say, this is what this means. Do you understand that, right? Experience breeds understanding. How would you interpret this? What questions would you ask? What is the change in attitude, condition, knowledge, behavior? What does that really mean? And that's what it is. That's what it's about. It's about measuring population change and specific activities that are mutually reinforcing towards a common goal. Well, I could say all those words, or I could say it's about working together to achieve the same thing. The language is really critical, and if you really want authentic engagement, that's something that is worth, I think, breaking down and start with all levels of participants. I personally had the most fun with the young people. It was very, very instructive, but also had a lot of fun with the community members who were like, what does that mean? That's not what we want to see as change. And charting that and translating that for yourself, there's what happens in front of the curtain and what happens behind the curtain. It matters that there's great understanding, and so I think that strategy, it's proven effective for us. And I'd love for you to try it and then get back to me and let me know if it's working for you as well.
I agree. I just would add that, we use collective impact and results-based accountability all the time, but we don't use those words. I think, the beautiful thing about it is having, structure, a system, some discipline regarding how you are doing your work. But, meeting people where they are is so critical. And I would just say, to Shakima's point, if you practice communicating that without using those terms, like having a conversation, you don't start with saying, so what's the story behind your curve? You start with, so what happened? What's been your experience? What happened? And so I think just kind of trying to break it down and translate it into a more practical frame is really helpful.
I think there's a question in the back.
Excellent, thank you. My name is Dominic Stucker with Collective Leadership Institute. Something that was of particular interest to me was this idea of a collaborative leadership team. That seems to be somehow at the core of the collective impact work that we're all trying to do. And so I have questions around that in terms of how informal or formal is it? How representative is it of the community, of the diversity? Is it including seemingly polarized political groups and representatives? Is it strictly community-based, or are you bringing in, is it private sector, public sector, who have a mandate to be working in these areas? So I think to the panel, my question is, could you share experiences around convening and getting commitment around those collaborative leadership teams? Perhaps the humility that goes along with not always having the answer and trusting that the answer comes from that team. Who is on them? What does that look like? Thanks.
I mean, when I was referring to it, it was in the context of a constituency-based leadership. In other words, so we're organizing a constituency, and so how do we develop a leadership team for an organizing campaign, for an organizing effort, whatever it might be? And there's actually extraordinarily useful research about what it takes to enable teams to work. And actually, the students at the Kennedy School started something called the Resistance School. I don't know if anybody saw that, but they put together these 4 days in which people could come in online as well as in person to learn some skills and tools needed for organizing. And I did one with them on launching leadership teams. So actually you can Google that because we combined role play with talk to actually show the steps involved, because there really is a method to this. And it involves, we're talking about teams of maybe 5 to 7 people. So it's not like a legislative body, it's an action team, and appropriately diverse in terms of skills, experience, and practice, and so forth. Bounded, it's clear who's on and who's not, and stable, where it's not every meeting we spend half the meeting telling the people who missed the last meeting what happened. It's like a clear, committed core of folks who then are able to agree upon a shared purpose, and we have a little exercise for that. Governing norms, like how they're going to make decisions, how they're going to handle commitments, and also a norm correction if they violate their norms. And finally, how to establish clear roles, not just tasks, but roles. And finally, what their name is going to be and what their chant is going to be. Yes, that's true. It's actually kind of cool thing. Now, you know, it sounds, what I'm saying may sound just trivial. It's not. Because there are ways to actually, with real intentionality and purpose, structure a leadership team, a collaborative leadership team. Richard Hackman was the basis of a lot of this research, who taught for many years the organization behavior program at Harvard, and did research with cabin crews, with orchestras. I mean, it's ironic in some ways that the private sector is way ahead in using some of these tools than we are, when collaborative work is so fundamental to our work. The point that we've added to that is then to think in terms of a team in which each team member has their own team. And then they have a team. And that's what makes it into what some people call a snowflake structure, where it's combining distributed leadership with collaborative leadership to reach deeply down into a constituency. But it takes real clarity and committing to some real practices and holding each other accountable, and it works. Now, that's not the same thing as a community-wide council, which I think I heard you talking about as well. I defer to others with more experience in that area.
Back to the Staten Island project, is the most recent collaborative that we work on. It's called the Workforce Initiative Network of Staten Island. You can find the documentation of the work from the convening to everything that happens during the convening to the end result, either on the JobSource NYC website. I think it's on the Staten Island Foundation website. But it is in the most basic way, getting all the stakeholders in the community together, presenting. What we do is going with the data. We know that the community has the conditions. We can research everything and anything. We present the data, and we ask a simple question: what are we missing? And we're missing a lot, because we don't live in those communities. And they tell us what we're missing. We go back, look for that additional information, incorporate what they've told us, and then we go back out and meet with them again and say, okay, here's what the full picture looks like. We convene, and in those initial convening, it's everyone. It's the churches, hospitals. We convene employers by themselves. So we convene various stakeholders. We document that information along the way about what we're finding, and the groups work their way through. I must tell you, it took us 24 months. It's the longest it has ever taken us to develop a collaborative, because they decided to do all island instead of just the North Shore, where they had the most issue. And it was great because they wanted to be, all of them wanted to be involved. But it did work its way down to, from 63 to a steering committee of 10, which includes the chamber and the college. But the other 50-something organizations have divided themselves up into working groups. And those working groups are focused on different things and aggregating folks in the community that are interested in training and education, for example, or interested in healthcare. So different community members have different passion. Each work group then go out and try to share what they're trying to work on with others to enlarge that group of people. So it is a very lengthy process, but it's well documented there from inception to all the meetings, to the flow charts, to everything that comes out of the meeting. It's a tedious read, but what we hope is that it presents an accurate picture of how you go about building a collaborative, starting with just an open call to a community.
And if I can just quickly build on that, we operate a similar structure, but we've been experimenting with a more horizontal approach in some of our communities, where there are a team of folks who are anchoring or serving as the backbone for the effort. And one of the things that I just want to tease out, because this is a bit of tension, is that in many communities, the backbone role and the identification of a single organization to play that role is almost anathema to who they are, right? And so we've had to be flexible in our approach to not impose a model, but to say, okay, if that is how you want to operate, let's talk about the practices, the activities, the roles associated with being a backbone that your organization may be more suited for. And so then trying to get people to specialize in a way that allows them to still work together, but in a more horizontal way, has been really important. And the big challenge, I think, with all of this is when you're working in communities of deep, concentrated poverty, communities that have been oppressed and where there's been a lot of trauma, there are factions, for lack of a better word. There's tension, there's fighting, and this is, not only in community, but it's also amongst the organizations. And so you have to work through all of that in order to help people get to a better place. And you can't resolve those issues you can't get people to work, and you can't talk about results until you wrestle with some of that stuff.
Well, yeah, the first step to solving a problem is admitting you have one, right? And I think for me, we have a similar structure, but there are three things that really, really matter: roles, goals, function. Just like your hand has function, your brain has function, your heart has function, your heart, head, hands, all of that works to create change. The same is true for your structure. And you have to be really, really clear about roles, goals, and function. And when you have that sense of clarity at the engagement, holding people accountable becomes much easier to do. And so that would be the only thing I would add to what my colleagues shared.
That will have to be our last comment, but I want you all to join me in thanking what I think has just been an extraordinary panel. Thank you so much.
Great to meet you.
So we are now going to transition into a 30-minute break, but before we do, I am going to ask you to just join me one more time and express an appreciation to Marshall, to Melody, Shakima, Marjorie, and Mark for this very important discussion. And before we officially transition, I do want to acknowledge and thank the Himes Foundation for sponsoring this break. Our breakout sessions are going to begin at 10:30, so we hope that you're able to enjoy this half-an-hour break, network, connect with each other, and please know that there are actually 2 break stations. So in addition to what's here on the mezzanine level in terms of snacks, we also have a break station on the 4th floor. In case the line gets a little bit long, we wanted you to know that there are some alternatives out there, and we hope that you all are able to enjoy these breakout sessions. We look forward to seeing you later today.